It began with a letter that wasn't meant for him, folded in aged perfumed paper, slipped beneath the door of his rented lakeside cabin during the quiet October of his self-imposed exile. Adrian was 24, a writer with more ambition than success, escaping the static noise of a life that had lately felt like a blank page, and the letter, unsigned and delicately written in cursive ink, simply said, "Come to the garden past midnight. Don't be seen." And though every rational part of him screamed of prank or mistake, something in the scent of the paper, or maybe the desperation behind the handwriting, called to him in ways he couldn't explain. So he went, and found her, standing in moonlight beneath wild roses, wrapped in a silk robe like a ghost from another century, older, much older than him, yet striking in the kind of way that made beauty irrelevant. Her name was Celeste, and she spoke as if she were confessing to the night, not to him, saying, "You shouldn't have come, but now that you're here you must never speak of this place again." And thus began a love story stitched together by midnight meetings, secrets exchanged like currency, and a growing ache neither of them dared name. For she was nearly twice his age and lived in the grand stone house on the hill that everyone in town whispered about but no one dared approach. The widow's house, they called it, though no one remembered a husband, and Celeste never answered questions, only asked them, always watching him with an intensity that both seduced and unsettled him, as if she was waiting for him to break some invisible rule she could never explain. And he, caught in the breathless rhythm of nights that bled into mornings, never once stopped to wonder why the garden seemed to change each time they met, as if it were alive, as if it remembered, and the flowers bloomed in colors he couldn't name. Her kisses were trembling, urgent, like she had only minutes left, and when he asked why she never came to him in daylight, she'd only smile faintly and say, "Because I'm more honest at night." And so he let the mystery pull him deeper, ignoring the warnings from townsfolk who claimed the house had been cursed since the fire decades ago, that no one had lived there since the accident, that Celeste couldn't possibly still be alive, because the woman who once lived there died in 1983, exactly 40 years ago. And when Adrian tried to laugh it off, his hands would shake and he couldn't explain why her photographs in the house looked untouched by time, why there were no mirrors, why his reflection sometimes flickered when he stood too close to her, or why he was starting to forget the sound of his own voice during the day, remembering only what it felt like to whisper her name in the dark, and when he finally asked who she really was she only said, "You'll find out when it's too late to leave," which should have terrified him, but instead made him love her more, because there was something about the sorrow behind her smile, the way she touched his face like she had once known another version of him, that made him feel like he'd been waiting his whole life for someone exactly like her. And as the autumn deepened and shadows lengthened, Adrian began to dream in other people's memories. Memories of war, of betrayal, of fire and blood, and a piano playing in a ruined room. And each morning, he woke with a name on his lips that wasn't his own. Adrian had always thought he understood loneliness, having lived most of his adult life orbiting around people he never quite belonged to. But with Celeste, loneliness took on a new texture, like a living, breathing thing. An invisible companion that sat between their silences and kissed the backs of their hands when they touched. In the weeks that followed their first encounter, Adrian found himself unable to resist returning to the wild garden that twisted behind the stone house, though the place itself seemed to resist logic. Its flowers blooming unnaturally in frost, its gates never locked yet always closed to everyone but him, and the more time he spent with Celeste, the more the world outside began to blur. Phone calls unanswered, writing deadlines missed, friends slowly fading from memory like dried ink on parchment. All that mattered was her, and the question she refused to answer. He'd ask why she kept old clocks that never moved, why the air in her bedroom smelled faintly of burning wood though there was no fireplace, why a room in the west wing was always locked and covered in ivy as if trying to forget itself, and Celeste would only stroke his cheek and say, "Darling, some answers only hurt." And then she would kiss him in a way that made him forget he had ever asked, and he let her because her touch was the only thing that made him feel real anymore. even as he began to notice that he was losing time, hours vanishing, dreams overlapping with waking life. His notebooks filled with words he didn't remember writing, some in a different hand altogether, signed with the name Gabriel. A name that returned again and again in his dreams, whispered in Celeste's voice during moments of great joy and unbearable grief, always tied to a promise he could never recall, always in that same burned room with the piano and the locket on the windowsill. Adrian tried to confront her one night, holding one of the photographs he had secretly taken from her mantel, a faded image of Celeste in the same silk robe she wore now, standing beside a man who looked just like him, but dated 1924. And when he showed her, she didn't react with shock or denial but sorrow, as if she had been waiting for this moment to return for decades, and all she said was, "I should have burned them all," and turned away, trembling like a tree caught in the wind. Still, Adrian couldn't leave because love doesn't always make sense, and sometimes the mystery becomes the attraction. The sense that if he just stayed long enough, asked the right question at the right time, he'd finally understand why she watched the lake every night as if expecting something to rise from it, or why her skin always felt cold no matter how close he held her, or why the air in the garden sometimes pulsed with invisible heat as if someone else were walking beside them, unseen but not unfelt. When he pressed her about the man in the photo, she whispered, "He loved me more than life," and that was his undoing, and then refused to speak another word for 3 days. On the 4th night, Adrian wandered into the town's tiny historical archive, desperate for truth, and found an old headline, "Prominent heiress Celeste Vailmont dies in mysterious fire. House deemed uninhabitable," dated October 14, 1983, exactly 40 years ago that week, and when he returned to the house, shaken and breathless, he found the lights flickering, the doors all open, the clocks ticking for the first time, and Celeste, waiting at the piano in the West Wing, playing a haunting melody he had never heard but somehow knew by heart, and when he whispered, "Are you a ghost?" she smiled through tears and said, "Only in the eyes of those who forgot me, but you never did, Gabriel." And suddenly, the name didn't sound foreign at all, it sounded like a wound reopening, like a truth breaking through layers of forgotten lives, and Adrian remembered a promise made in another life, by firelight, beneath the stars. To love her across time no matter the cost. Adrian sat beside her at the piano, stunned into silence as her fingers continued to dance along the ivory keys in that slow, aching melody that stirred something ancient inside him, and when she turned to look at him, her eyes no longer held just the softness of a lonely woman guarding her secrets. They burned with recognition, with grief, with love born long before his lifetime. "You remember, don't you?" she whispered, not pleading but certain, and the strange thing was he did, not as memories, but as sensations. The weight of a gold locket in his hand, the heat of a burning house at his back, the coldness of a betrayal that came from someone he once called brother. "I don't know how," he murmured, "but I think I always knew you," and Celeste, usually so guarded, broke. Tears slid down her cheeks and she clutched his hand like she feared he'd vanish again. "And she said, you promised you'd find me, even if it took 100 years, and then, like waves crashing into his consciousness, he saw it, another life, another him, dressed in 1920s finery, stealing her away from a grand ballroom and kissing her like the world was ending, promising they'd run, escape her controlling family and the legacy they were cursed to protect, and then fire, betrayal, a ritual half complete. Her soul torn from his arms by forces he didn't understand, and the terrible final moment when he was left behind, weeping as the house burned and time swallowed them both. Adrian stood, staggering from the vision, and Celeste followed him, barefoot and desperate, saying it was real, all of it, we were cursed by time itself, Gabriel. And every time we find each other, something rips us apart before dawn, and as he tried to process it all as reason waged war with instinct, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway, heavy, deliberate, approaching, and Celeste went pale and whispered, "He's found us again," and before Adrian could ask who, the door burst open and a man stood there, tall, ageless, dressed in black with eyes like glass, and he said, "You broke the pact, Celeste." And Adrian's blood ran cold as memories of that man surfaced, not as dreams but as nightmares. A name floated up. Marius, the one who kept them apart through lifetimes, the one who had loved Celeste first and never forgave her for choosing Gabriel. For choosing him. Leave her, Marius said, and you can walk away with your mind intact. Stay, and I'll tear you out of time again. But Adrian didn't move, couldn't, because even if he didn't understand everything yet, he understood enough. He loved her, truly, deeply. Across time, across death, and even though he could feel the air bending around them, reality warping with the return of old magic, he whispered, no, and stepped in front of her, shielding her with his body, and Celeste whispered something in a language Adrian didn't recognize. A command, a spell, a vow, and the candles blew out, the piano cracked, and the man vanished like mist into moonlight. But the price was clear. Celeste collapsed, shaking, her body flickering like a failing projection. And she said through gritted teeth, he's tearing the thread again. We're running out of time. And Adrian, full of terror and love, held her, and promised her again, as he had in 100 lifetimes, I'll fix this. I'll find a way to keep you. And she smiled weakly and said, you always say that, and you never do. And then she vanished completely, right there in his arms, leaving behind only the scent of roses and the memory of a melody that had no ending. The lake was quiet. Unnaturally so, as if the world itself was holding its breath after Celeste vanished. And Adrian remained on his knees in the broken piano room, gripping the last trace of her, the locket, now warm in his hand like a living thing. And when he opened it, there was no photograph inside. Only a mirror that reflected not his face but the burning ballroom from his dreams, and the words "Find the thread" etched into the glass in a language he shouldn't have known but somehow did. He wandered through the house, dazed, as if caught between layers of time, seeing flickers of people who weren't there, a woman crying in the hallway, a boy running down the stairs, a fire burning behind the library walls, and every time he blinked, something changed. A portrait aged in reverse, a room rearranged, the date on his phone jumping years at a time, until he was no longer sure what year it truly was. Desperate for answers, Adrian returned to the town archives, digging through forgotten files and whispers, and found a journal written by a woman named Eleanor Marin, dated 1925, detailing her work with the Threadwalkers, a secret society that believed souls were stitched into fate by literal threads. Golden filaments that wove time, memory, and love together, and that sometimes when grief was strong enough or love deep enough, two souls could rip through time to find each other again, but at great cost. One passage chilled him. They call it the curse of the unseamed. When a soul refuses to let go, time retaliates, fracturing reality until the lovers lose not just each other, but themselves. And Adrian knew without a doubt that he and Celeste were trapped in exactly that cycle, punished not for loving, but for never letting go. He returned to the house, to the wild garden that was now blooming in impossible ways, morning glories at midnight, roses with petals made of frost, and stood in the center as the wind whispered in her voice, "The thread is fraying, hurry." And as he focused on the memory of her face, something unlocked inside him. A flood of moments not from this life but from others. A battlefield in 1812, where he'd held her dying in his arms. A plague-ridden city where they were healers, executed as witches, for loving too publicly. A shipwreck in 1609, where she had clung to him as the sea swallowed them both. And each life ended before it should have, each time ripped apart by a shadowy figure always watching, Marius or something older wearing his face, always ensuring they never reached the final vow. In the center of the garden, beneath the oldest tree, Adrian found a stone ring buried under the roots. A ring engraved with both his and her initials, G+C. And as soon as he touched it, the garden shifted, the trees bending, the moon splitting like a cracked mirror, and he fell into another time, another version of the house, where Celeste stood at the balcony in a 19th century gown, waiting, gasping when she saw him, crying out, "Gabriel, you found the rift." And he ran to her, not caring how or why, only that she was real again, and they kissed like the first time and the last time all at once, clinging to each other as the air shimmered and tried to tear them apart again. But this time, Adrian held on, shouting the words he found in the journal. Thread unbroken, fate awoken, love remembered, never stolen, and something in the house roared. Not a voice but a force, ancient and angry, and the world twisted, light bending into color as time shuddered like it had been struck at its core, and suddenly the house went still, the clock silent again, and Celeste looked at him not like a ghost, but a woman who had just truly returned to life, and whispered, "You said it. You found it. You anchored me." Before collapsing into his arms, not fading but exhausted and alive, the days that followed felt like a borrowed dream. Celeste truly there in the morning, not just a shadow of moonlight, her hands warm in his, her laughter echoing through the hallways of the old house that now seemed to breathe easier with her presence, the air lighter, the mirrors no longer veiled in fabric, and for the first time, Adrian dared to imagine a future instead of just memories repeating. They spoke of the lives they remembered, fitting the pieces together like broken china. The duel in Paris, the rain-soaked escape through Prague, the marriage that never happened in Florence, and the letters she wrote to him in blood during a war they both died in. But always, always there was Marius, and it was Celeste who finally told him the truth. Marius had not just been a jilted lover from a forgotten century, but a threadhawker himself, one of the first, a scholar who had discovered how love could bend fate. But when Celeste chose Gabriel, Adrian, instead of him, Marius snapped, using the forbidden right to twist the thread, ensuring that if he couldn't have her, no one could, especially not the man who loved her through every lifetime. He believes love is a possession, she said, staring into the fire that night. But it isn't, it's the risk of losing, and choosing to love anyway, and as Adrian reached for her hand, the flames roared higher for a moment, like reacting to her words, and something clicked inside him, an idea. If Marius could bend fate with a ritual, could they reverse it, rewrite the ending, once and for all? Celeste was hesitant, terrified, but Adrian had changed. He was no longer just a man caught in someone else's curse. He remembered too much, felt too deeply, and the thread inside him pulsed like it was calling for completion. So they turned to the library at the edge of the West Wing, long sealed with wax and roses, the place Celeste once feared to open, and together they broke the seal and entered a room thick with time, where books floated midair and a map of souls shimmered on the ceiling. Glowing lines connecting thousands of names, some dim, some still lit, and at the center, two golden threads tangled endlessly, one for Celeste, one for Adrian, both frayed, both fighting against a dark knot shaped like a serpent, pulsing with Marius's mark. It was there that they found the ritual of rebinding, a forbidden rite meant not to travel time but to stitch two souls into one shared thread, ensuring they would never again be torn apart. But the cost was high. One of them would have to offer a memory, a true and sacred one, never to be remembered again, to balance the weave, and if the ritual failed, they would be lost not just to time, but to existence itself, as if neither had ever lived. Celeste begged him not to try it, afraid of losing him entirely. But Adrian only held her and whispered, "I'd rather forget everything than go another life without knowing your name." And they began the ritual under the old willow tree, where the garden bent space around them, the stars circling above as if watching, and they spoke the vow in perfect unison, calling out to the old thread that bound them. "Unravel what was broken, weave what cannot be torn, bind our breath and blood beyond time and death." And as they spoke, the knot trembled, the garden shook, and a figure stepped from the shadows, Marius looking younger than before, his eyes filled not with anger but sorrow as he whispered, "I only ever wanted her to choose me." And Celeste, voice calm, replied, "I did. In another life." But that choice died with that life, and Marius, finally seeing the weight of what he had done across centuries, stepped back and said, "Then I will unmake what I made," and reached toward the knot with trembling fingers, and as he touched it, the serpent dissolved into starlight, and the thread glowed with a light so bright it seared the edges of the world. The light faded slowly, like the last breath of a long-held secret, and when Adrian opened his eyes, the world felt quiet, not the eerie silence of a haunted space, but the soft hush of peace after centuries of storms. Celeste was still in his arms, but something had changed, her hair now streaked with silver that hadn't been there moments before, and a faint golden mark shimmered along her collarbone. A thread, barely visible, etched into her skin like a vow sealed into flesh, and when Adrian tried to recall the words they'd spoken in the ritual, he found only silence in his memory. He had sacrificed something, a true memory, and it was gone. Celeste saw the confusion on his face and cupped his cheek with a trembling smile, saying, "You gave up the first moment you ever loved me." And it hit him with strange sadness, that the spark, the heartbeat of their story was now hers alone. But also a kind of joy, knowing she'd carry that flame for both of them. Marius was gone, not dead but dissolved, freed from the cycle by his own remorse, his thread finally severed from theirs, leaving behind only a single black feather on the grass, which Celeste picked up and placed in the pages of her journal, whispering, "Let this be the end of the unmaking." And the wind carried her words away like a blessing. Over the days that followed, the house began to shift, walls breathing with warmth, clocks ticking in time, the garden returning to its natural rhythm, and for the first time in centuries, the mirrors showed only what was truly there. Two souls, weathered by time but no longer haunted by it. They spent those days like dreamers afraid to wake. Adrian writing again, words flowing not from fantasy but memory, strange stories that felt like echoes from lives once lived, and Celeste tending to her roses with fingers no longer stiff from cold. They made love slowly, like people rediscovering language, relearning the feel of each other's skin, not as ghosts of 100 pasts, but as flesh, as now, as real. And in the quiet hours before dawn, Adrian would sometimes lie beside her and stare at her sleeping face, and feel that even if he never remembered their first kiss, he would never again forget this one. Yet peace was never meant to be permanent, only possible, and on the 13th day, Celeste began to weaken, subtle at first, a falter in her step, a shadow in her gaze, and when Adrian confronted her, she confessed the truth she'd hidden even from herself. "I didn't just share your thread, Gabriel. I tethered mine to yours," she said, her voice a whisper of wind. "And I was already fading long before you found me again." And in that moment Adrian understood. The ritual had worked, but the time stolen from her across so many lives had taken its toll. And now that the curse was broken, she no longer had the borrowed energy that had kept her in between life and death. She was alive, yes, but not for long, not unless the final rite was completed, the weaving of continuance, which required both souls to stand at the heart of Threadwalk, a mythical place beyond time. Accessible only once per cycle of the thread, and the next opening was in 2 days at midnight, beneath the lunar eclipse, in the place where it all began, the ballroom beneath the lake, drowned 100 years ago in fire and grief. Adrian didn't hesitate. He would carry her there if he had to, and she, though afraid, nodded and whispered, "If we do this, there's no turning back. We'll either be reborn in every life, or disappear from all of them." And he kissed her with the weight of lifetimes behind it, promising her, not with words but with action, that love would not falter again. They traveled by moonlight, Adrian carrying Celeste when her steps faltered, their path lit by a sky turning red with the coming eclipse, and the closer they drew to the lake, the more the world around them shimmered, time slipping at the edges, birds flying in reverse, shadows pausing to watch them, as if the very fabric of existence knew something rare was unfolding, something final. Celeste clutched the locket he had once given her, now whole again, pulsing faintly with golden light, and whispered stories to him from the lifetimes he could no longer remember, tales of poems left in walls, secret rendezvous in temples, stolen kisses during war, and always, always, the fire, the betrayal, the separation. They reached the lake just before midnight, the air thick with silence, the water like black glass, and as the eclipse began, the moon turning red above them, the surface of the lake began to ripple, not from wind, but from memory, and a glow rose from beneath, revealing the ballroom that had drowned long ago. Still intact, submerged but untouched, preserved in time's pocket, and a staircase of light appeared, descending beneath the surface, daring them to follow. Adrian went first, his breath catching as water parted around him, not wetting him, but folding like curtains, and Celeste followed, her body flickering slightly, her thread straining, and together they entered the ballroom, chandeliers still lit, dust dancing in air that shouldn't exist, and at the center, a golden loom stood where the orchestra once played, ancient and enormous, its thread stretched between two mirrors that showed not reflection but memory. One of Celeste, smiling on a swing in 1864, and one of Adrian, writing poetry alone in 1977, and as they stepped forward, the loom came alive, spinning thread from their hearts, gold and crimson and midnight blue, singing softly in voices of every version they had ever been. Celeste's hand trembled in his and she said, "We either complete the thread or unravel." "Completely," and Adrian, without fear, only love, replied. "Then let's finish what began long before we were ever born." And they stood within the loom, the final right beginning. Not words but emotions, memories rising from their skin like smoke. Their first kiss in 1420. Their first death in 1812. Their quiet laughter in the forest 1953. Their arguments, their promises, their regrets. And as they wept, the loom responded, weaving faster, brighter, until a dark knot began to form again. Marius's final curse lingering like a shadow, and for a moment, it seemed it might strangle the thread again. But Celeste stepped forward, whispering to the knot not in anger, but in forgiveness, offering it her final memory, the moment of her own death in the fire, and as she released it, the knot began to unravel, not in pain but in peace, fading like a sorrow finally forgiven, and the loom flashed white gold, then silence. The mirrors shattered inward. The ballroom trembled and time stopped. For a long breathless moment they floated, not in water, not in light but in pure memory, a place without before or after, and they held each other, not knowing if this was the end or the beginning until Celeste whispered, "Wherever we wake next, find me," and Adrian replied, "In every lifetime I always do," and the world broke apart around them like glass. And then, Adrian opened his eyes to morning light. A small apartment. A desk cluttered with notes. A steaming cup of tea. He was 24. A writer. And yet something pulsed beneath his skin. A memory. His phone buzzed. An unknown number. A message. "Come to the garden past midnight. Don't be seen." He blinked. Looked up. On the street below, an older woman in a long red coat looked up at his window, then walked away into the mist, the scent of roses trailing behind her. And though he didn't know her name, his heart raced in a way that felt like remembering. He smiled. He stood. And once again he followed the thread.